everybody. Thank you for coming out to CXC 2021. It's good to have people gathered around comics again. My name is Jersey Drost. I'm the interim executive director of CartoonCrossroadsColumbus.org. Stuff happening later today and all day tomorrow. This event, CXC is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and we couldn't do this without the support of individual donors, grants, and corporate sponsorships. And I want to take this moment to thank these sponsors that are up on the screen. They helped make it possible to do all this amazing stuff that we've been doing this weekend. And also, can we thank our partners? Because the story I always tell, I love to tell, is when I first came to CXC as an attendee, driving all the way from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Sorry, I moved here. I chose here. But yes, I came from Ann Arbor. I drove home, and I remember almost screaming to my wife, it's like the whole darn town celebrates comics. And sure enough, yes, look at all of these different organizations that create spaces and events. There's exhibitions happening at the Columbus Museum of Art, at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum, and also at the OSU Urban Art Space, by the way, I should say. Registration for the walking tour is closed at the Urban Art Space. They capped attendance there, but the opening reception, there are still free tickets available for that. And Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the eastern woodland tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land that we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. Now to introduce our presenter, Ben Towle. I'm so excited about this because, Columbus is a really awesome place for cartoonists to live, and a lot of them have moved here, and this is one of our local people that we're going to celebrate today. And wow, it's like, that's not very exotic. He's from here. But listen to when I read this to you, like how exciting it is this person is here. Ben Towle is a 4-time Eisner-nominated cartoonist. The Eisners, if you don't know, that's like the Oscars for comics. His previous works include Oyster War, Amelia Earhart, This Broad Ocean with Sarah Stewart Taylor, which received accolades from the New York Times and Publishers Weekly, and was a Junior Library Guild selection. Oh. Midnight Sun and Farewell, Georgia. He lives in Columbus, Ohio, and is a professor of illustration at, the Columbus College of Art and Design. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben Towle. Can we please welcome him very warmly?
And we'll give you the little full screen.
Oh, you know how to do it.
I think I can get it. There it goes. All right. Oh my gosh, I'm very loud. Hey everybody, thanks so much. It's great to be here at an actual IRL convention. It's the first in a long time. I'm sort of tethered like that poor dog in Mutts. But I'll get used to it. So anyway, I'm Ben Towle, and I'm talking here mainly because I have a book out that I have just completed. I was going to throw a few little odds and ends at you for anyone who might be interested. I assume if you're here, you have some interest in the subject matter at hand, which is animals at war. So I did a nonfiction book called Four-Fisted Tales, Animals in Combat, and this is just kind of as a placeholder image here. This is a memorial or a monument in London to animals in combat. It has this very sort of trenchant byline on it, which is they had no choice, which is in fact true. I've done some other books in the past. This is my book that's currently out. And oh, wait a minute, I think this thing has some sort of one of them laser guns on it. There we go. So this is my book that's out now. I've done a few other books in the past. This is my previous book, which is kind of a nautical fantasy thing, sort of a mishmash of sea monster and pirate tales with sort of a kind of Tintin-esque kind of aesthetic. And then this book that I did a number of years ago has just been reissued by Hachette. And it's a sort of slightly fictionalized telling of Amelia Earhart's crossing of the Atlantic from Trepassey, Newfoundland to Liverpool, I believe. So anyway, I'm just going to just talk a little bit about some bits and pieces of stuff from related to military animals. So this little byline up here is what's on the back of my book, but that is because that is what it is about. So as it says, animals have fought alongside people, humans, for almost really since the beginning of beginning of people fighting with each other, which presumably happened about the same time people emerged. And there's some really interesting stories, I think, about these animals. So I was going to look actually at some of the kind of real stories behind the ones that wound up in the book, a few that kind of wound up on the cutting room floor, a few little sort of Easter eggs or things that you might not notice if you just kind of picked up the book and went through it. A little bit of maybe some few little sources I can suggest about drawing animals, because drawing animals is a little different than drawing people. I discovered, much to my chagrin, when I decided that I was going to draw a book with like 18 different stories, each of which featured a different variety of animals. And then just if I had time, I was going to maybe throw out a few suggestions for some of my favorite sort of military and war comics, and then take a little Q&A from people. So let's see, how does this work? All right, so digging right into things. There are a lot of cats, strangely, involved in military stuff, but most often you see them as ship's cats. Cats started out, the sort of tradition of having a cat on your ship dates back to the Egyptians, who started moving grain around. And when you get grain, you get rats, right? And then the rats eat your grain, and then you're sad because you don't have anything to sell. So they would get, they domesticated cats. So if you have a cat, it is the descendant most likely of an Egyptian cat, because that's where sort of domesticated cats started. But there's a lot of ship's cats, and some of them have some pretty hilarious stories associated with them. So there's a big spread in the book of lots of different ship's cats, but I was trying to narrow them down and finding sort of the most notable cats. I think I can take this off since everybody's safely far away. So one of them that I thought was particularly hilarious is this. Is Fred 1 Pound, who is official rank of able sea cat. He was named 1 Pound because he was a pound when he was born. He's been around the world, he has traveled as many miles in the British Navy as the equivalent of 10 trips around the world. But the thing that really drew me to him was this notation that I saw in a book showing that he had 2 good conduct badges and 1 mark of disgraceful conduct involving an incident in a fish market. So they didn't really go into it too much, but I mean, I made up the event. I assumed that he was absconding with a fish. So I don't know, any cat cats are pretty good at disgraceful conduct, honestly. So another thing that I discovered, much to my delight in researching ship's cats, is that apparently sailors will make little hammocks for them to sleep in. So which, I think is adorable, of course, but it also kind of, to me, is sort of, kind of shows the sort of role and importance that these animals sometimes have to people. These guys are probably, in the midst of a pretty harrowing situation, and yet they're drawing some kind of solace from caring for these animals, and building them little hammocks. One of the other kind of more remarkable things that I stumbled on was these creatures, which are Gambian pouched mice, or pouched rats, rather. And they are used currently in places that have been heavily landmined, of which there are a lot of places. And the problem is you look at places like Vietnam and Cambodia and places like that, there's a lot of buried ordnance under the ground, and it makes a lot of the land unusable, and it's a real economic problem, because that's where you got to grow food, right? You got to plant stuff in the ground, and it's full of mines. That's not cool. So it's been a extremely difficult to get rid of these things, because they still can blow up, many years later. And heretofore they would try to do it with humans, which obviously is extremely dangerous, and dogs they will use as well, but. Problem, of course, is that dogs are heavy enough that if they land on a mine, they're going to set it off. Dogs are also tend to be if you have a dog, they are very bonded to you in particular. So if, the dog's particular trainer doesn't happen to be there that day, sometimes the dogs aren't very useful, and they can take years to train a dog to sniff out mines. But they've found that these rats are actually very, very good at it, and you can tell they're sort of giant, which is sort of cool. They're very big. The pouch refers they don't have a pouch like a marsupial, but they have pouched cheeks for chewing stuff. But they put them on these little tracks, and they sort of run back and forth up and down the area that they're looking for landmines in. And they detect mines rather than like a metal detector, which is kind of the basis of human mine sweeping. that can, detect things like, old Coke can tops and stuff. They are actually trained to smell explosives. So they don't get a lot of false positives from that kind of stuff. And they're also incredibly fast. So, a human and dog team, would take 2 to 3 days to clear around 200 square meters of land. And a single Gambian pouch rat can do that in about 30 minutes. So I thought they were kind of cool creatures. Sadly, they're not available as pets. I looked up, you're not allowed to import them. People have, and they've gotten loose in Florida. Everything's always Florida. They've gotten loose in Florida, and they're like wreaking havoc with the ecosystem down there. Florida's full of all kinds of weird stuff, like alligators and things. Last thing you need are like pouch rats running around. There are also a lot of stories. I tried to keep it to a minimum, but there are a lot of stories in here about carrier pigeons, which are actually really remarkable creatures. This guy here is, and I put him in, this is the D-Day invasion at Normandy, and I put this pigeon up here on the top. That is Gustav, who was a RAF pigeon. And of course, during D-Day, the whole point of it was that it was a surprise, right? You didn't want to announce to the Nazis that you're going to be showing up next Tuesday on the beach with a lot of guns. So there was an enforced radio silence when the landing took place. So the first news of D-Day actually arrived from carrier pigeon because they were not communicating on radio. Let me get rid of this thing. There we go. Okay. And so he actually received the Dickin Medal for Bravery, which is a British military award that's known as kind of the Animals Victoria Cross. And this is this other guy. Then you can see he's got his medal there as well. That one pigeon over there is G.I. Joe, who, and I have his story in the book. He actually flew 20 miles in 20 minutes to deliver a message that there were 150 French troops that were garrisoned and trapped in a city and were getting rained down on by allies who thought they were a bunch of Nazis. So they had to dispatch this pigeon, who then reported and it was like, "Stop shooting us, we're on your team." Then thus, saved the lives of all this, this pretty sizable group of soldiers. And then the one on the far end is Cherami, who did a very similar flight, saving a battalion of soldiers, flying 25 miles in 25 minutes. So they're pretty remarkable creatures. Here's a couple things I didn't put in, but I thought that were kind of interesting. This dog up here this is Cairo, and he's the dog that was on the Bin Laden raid. And so he's probably the most famous modern military animal that's floating around, and kind of sort of very cool, but also kind of hilarious is that their dogs are used routinely in special forces stuff. So you'll see these guys skydiving with like a dog in a sack, kind of, and it looks a little bit like those. I'm sure you've maybe seen those pictures of guys riding on the subway in New York, where the regulations are such that you can bring a dog on the subway as long as it's in a bag of some sort. And I guess the idea was that people would take their teacup poodles and stuff, but not their regular sized dogs. But then there's these pictures you can see of guys with like an IKEA bag with like a pit bull in it, sort of over their shoulders. So whenever I see these guys, I'm like, that's real badass. But I'm like, it also looks like those guys on the subway with like a German Shepherd and a backpack, This kind of interestingly is from the invasion of Afghanistan, and there are still areas that are pretty difficult to move around in on anything other than an animal, and these are actually U.S. Special Forces on a horseback. And so there was sort of a scramble when that invasion took place to see whether anybody in the cavalry still actually knew how to ride any horses. And so there apparently was sort of a small subset of people somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the U.S. Army who were, training horses and training guys to ride on them. And I didn't really include these because, one thing is that there are actually 2 recent books about these, so I kind of felt like those bases are covered. There's also like 5 billion dog stories, and I kind of felt like I drew a kind of a hard limit at 2 dog stories because I wanted to get some other varieties of animals involved. There are also some that I didn't include because they were just too grim. You know, it's like it's already sort of a bit of a touchy subject to like, you know, like as it says, they had no choice. You know, you can valorize these creatures to some extent, but you also have to recognize that, you know, they indeed had no choice, and many of them died tragically. And this is from a fairly preposterous idea, which was that after the Pearl Harbor invasion, that they were going to basically strap little bombs to bats and then release them over Japan. And then the bats would then like fly down into Tokyo and roost under the eaves of houses, which is where bats like to hang out. And then at some point, the bombs would go off, and it would burn down, you know, all the structures in Tokyo. What it actually burned down was the base where they were training these bats to do this. So here's the base going up in flames. And I didn't want to have a story in there where it ended up with all the animals burning up. You know, that's not cool. And then also, very similarly, somewhat, you know, it makes you realize how awful humans are really as animals sometimes. Doing these stories is the Soviet army at one point would train dogs to run under tanks. And they had originally had this idea that they would run under there and deposit a bomb and then run back out. And they just figured out that that last part wasn't really working. So they would send these poor dogs under these tanks and then blow up the dog and the tank and everything else. And so, you know, that's just too depressing for me. I'm an animal person. I can't do an 8-page story about dogs getting blown up. Although if you can get over the macabre nature of it, there is actually a fairly hilarious aspect to this story, which is that that Soviet tanks at the time were diesel, and German tanks at the time ran on regular gasoline. So what the dogs actually were associating, because dogs associate things like that, is they were associating the smell of the diesel with their target. So when they released these dogs to go get the German tanks, they just ran out of the Soviet tanks and blew them up. So I'd like to think that was intentional on the part of the dogs. You know, like if I'm going out, I'm taking you with me. So those are just a few animal stories that I kind of threw in there, and then some that I didn't, that I thought I'd throw at you. So I also have a bit of a few little kind of Easter eggs. I always put stuff in my books, and I never know whether anybody picks up on them. Occasionally people will mention them to me. I think it was Dan Klaus at one point who kind of very famously said, like, if you can always be confident that if you're in comics, no one will actually read your books very closely. Because he throws in a lot of stuff, I think, that he thinks people are going to notice and they don't. Although I hope at this point people are noticing Dan Klaus stuff. But I threw in a few things that, just things that I like. I think it's fun to kind of throw stuff in and see whether anyone recognizes them. So one thing is that, I mean, I love sound effects in comics. There was a period when that people sort of decided that things like sound effects and thought balloons and things were not sort of, you know, comics were not for kids anymore, and so you didn't use that stuff, which I think is foolish. Those are all things that are part of our toolkit as cartoonists. You know, why chuck them out the window? And so, you know, I really love the real classic bam and blam, and obviously if you're doing a book where there's guns and things shooting, you want to have some sound effects, right? So I basically kind of nabbed my letter forms from my favorite sound effects letterer of all time, and that's this guy here. His name Ben Towle, and he did all the lettering for EC Comics for things like Two-Fisted Tales, which is the book that my title is kind of an homage to, and Frontline Combat and all that kind of stuff. But if you look at old EC Comics, unless you are looking at the, like if you're looking at the EC Comics that are hand lettered, there'll be his hand lettering. Some of them are done with a Leroy lettering press. That's obviously not him. And then all the sound effects are him as well. And they have this very, very distinctive look to them, which I think I really, really love. And you know, I'm not a digital hater by any means. In fact, this entire book was drawn digitally. But there's a certain I think there's just a certain kind of warmness and character that you can get with hand sound effects lettering that gets lost, I think, these days, when a lot of sound effects lettering basically is taking like a digital letter form and just kind of manipulating it a little bit. So that's all in there, kind of as an homage. Another homage I sometimes like, sometimes just as an homage and sometimes as a kind of formal challenge to myself. I try to use other artists' page layouts to see whether I can make them work. And so this is a story in which basically I have a narrator, who's this guy in the center, or he's involved in a conversation, and events are being relayed to him by someone else in the room with him, and then we, the reader, are seeing those events sort of as he's, as they're being communicated to him. And so I was trying to figure out a good way to do that, and it occurred to me that one of my favorite war comics, and I'll have some other stuff about this guy later, are by this French artist named Jacques Tardy, and he had, for some reason I had in my brain that there's a whole sequence of these things in this book, but there actually, I guess it was just that one page. But that's the kind of layout that I think if a student came up to me with, I'd be like, no, don't use that. That doesn't make any kind of sense, right? Because it's hard to quite know what the reading order is here. But I thought this was a good use of it, just because these aren't really things that are occurring. Like the relationship between this inner panel and these outer panels isn't necessarily one of a sequence, right? That they're going on simultaneously. Like he's hearing this stuff simultaneously. This is the stuff that he is sort of hearing in his brain. So I thought that was a good idea. In fact, my book I'm working on right now, I'm actually making myself use only page layouts that are taken from Pluto by Naoki Urasawa. And it's been kind of an interesting exercise. I find like any time you can sort of formally challenge yourself, it's in a way it kind of, to my mind, sort of really encourages creativity rather than stifles it. Here's another kind of example of that, is that I have one story in here about a bear that was actually part of the Polish army in the early part of World War II. And it's a whole sequence is, well, I hate the word silent, it's wordless. All comics are silent, they're books. It is a wordless comic. And it is very much influenced by the young me who read this comic when I was a wee kid. This is obviously a licensed G.I. Joe comic, but it was entirely, it's the most unusual G.I. Joe story ever. And it's unusual because it doesn't have any words. It's also unusual because it doesn't have any words and you can actually understand the damn thing. Because most of the times when people attempt to do a wordless comic, it doesn't read very well. Because it's extremely difficult to pull off. You can't, I feel like comics a lot of the times, particularly like you look at Golden Age superhero comics and like Reed Richards pulls somebody out of a burning rocket and there's got to be somebody standing by going, Reed Richards is pulling someone out of that burning rocket, right? So like you've got that second bit of reinforcement, and when you take that away, it can be very difficult. It really kind of makes you see whether you've got the chops to pull that kind of storytelling off. Kind of as a divergence, but I mean, I remember in the 90s at one point that Marvel did what did they call it? They did a whole, their whole gimmick was that they did a whole, I don't know if it was a whole week or a whole month of silent, wordless comics, and everything in their lineup was wordless, and you could not understand a goddamn one of them. They just didn't make any sense at all, and it made you realize that even pro people who are working for Marvel, you take that away from them, they were having a hard time kind of pulling a story together. So kind of what I did though, to kind of challenge myself is that, so not only did I do this wordlessly, but I actually took the page layout and basic composition from this G.I. Joe comic and repurposed it for the entire story. So so you can see where in each particular image, for example, I've got, sometimes a little more loosely than others, but I've kind of grabbed the positions of characters and things like that and tried to do the whole story. It's only a 7-page story, and it's a 22-page book, so I was able to grab 7 pages that worked pretty well. But that's kind of a deep cut. I'm genuinely curious whether anybody who just sort of casually reads this book is going to pick up on that. But we'll see. It's been out for a month. Nobody's noticed it yet. Kind of the other thing that was involved in this, obviously, was a lot of drawing of animals, right? And animals are kind of I was going to say a difficult beast. They are beasts. They're difficult to draw. They're somewhat unusual. We're fortunate at CCAD that at least before the pandemic, we would get, the animation department would bring in animals on Fridays or Saturdays, I can't remember, I think Fridays, for the animation students to draw. So I would always kind of mooch off of that and go over there and draw animals. So it's nice to have a little bit of background on that. Although it is sort of chaos sometimes. They'll bring in these animals and they brought in puppies one time. And I mean, it was just you pour up 20 puppies into a room full of people and it's just abject chaos. They did bring a sloth in one time, and I was like, finally, an animal that's still, you know, like you can actually draw the damn thing instead of it like racing around the room. But yeah, so they are unusual to draw if you're not used to drawing them because they have sort of odd anatomy. And one of the books that I thought was really, really helpful is this old How to Draw Animals book by Jack Ham. And I'll admit I don't really know what Jack Ham did as a cartoonist, but every like old, you know, thrift store book of Jack Ham's that I've found is brilliant. He's got another one that I think is just called Cartooning the Head and Hands. I think it's a red cover and it's just amazing. It's one of those ones that I still, you know, a lot of my how-to books I stick in my office at school and stuff, but that's one that I often bring home. And this one actually is currently at home as well for this reason. And you can see that he kind of goes through basic animal anatomy stuff and then also like, you know, real basic structures of the horse's head and stuff like that. He goes through for every single animal. He talks about basic shapes. It's the sort of basic thing that I'm sure some of you guys, if you're artists, have seen that sort of meme that goes around that's like how to draw the owl. You know, it has like 2 circles. It goes, first draw 2 circles, and then it has the fully finished owl on the end, and it says, then draw the goddamn owl. You know? But that's what this is based on, this thing from this Jack Ham book. Another one that's really worth getting if you're interested in animal drawings is this Art of Animal Character Design. And it's a little more focused on taking animals as a basis for a sort of a more anthropomorphized animal design later on in the process. But I think that he has lots of really good information and advice about drawing at zoos, and like these are drawings done like at a dog park and stuff like that. One of the sort of more challenging things about animal anatomy is, what the heck is this? Like, you know, if you've got a dog or a cat, they seem to have like an extra part of their leg that's really kind of hard to wrap your brain around because you're used to drawing a certain number of limbs, and it becomes all the more horrifying when you realize that the way you sort of have to think about this is that you sort of think that like, well, this part here is the thigh, right? And then this part here is the calf, and then that's the foot, and then like, what is this thing, right? Yes, but that's horrifying because when then you have this in your brain, and you're like, that's awful. It's like a pumpkin head or something, you know? Like, that's not cool. So like learning how to draw that stuff is it is a challenge, I'll say. You know, the fact that I have a dog around, I had a cat around until pretty recently, but even doing that, just drawing, you know, in your sketchbook or whatever, it does take a little bit of understanding to do them. And I even after having drawn this book, I think if I look through the book now, I definitely have a few wonky, like cat and dog legs in there somewhere. In retrospect, I probably should have done it all about rats because I'm pretty good at drawing rats now. And they don't have quite as pronounced a sort of weird leg on the end of them. And then finally, I thought, you know, I'm not a huge, war comics isn't really anything that I was really super passionate about, like before I got into this book, but I guess kind of in reading up, you know, as a cartoonist, you tend to, or at least I tend to, when I get to a challenge, I'm like, how did somebody else solve this? You know, how have other people addressed this kind of thing? So I wound up kind of in the course of doing this, like, reading up on some other, you know, people who've done comics about sort of war and military things. So I thought I'd throw a few of them out there, just kind of as recommendations if you're interested in this sort of stuff, some other things to maybe look at. So one of them is this guy I mentioned before. This is a French cartoonist named Jacques Tardy, and he has a number of books out now that are sort of based on this original one, but this one's called It Was the War of the Trenches. And it's a World War I story, and it's you know, it's probably his masterpiece at this point. And you can see that I'm to some extent, if you look at my book, which you know, I showed you a few little clips of with the green single color in the background. It's very much kind of an emulation of this style that I really like, where you have black line art on a white page, and then you have this other sort of third interim, like, you know, and if it were color, it would be what they call Pantone spot color. But you have this third color in there, and I've done a lot of books like this, and I'm sort of emulating stuff like this, and also stuff like one of my favorite cartoonists is a guy named Roy Crane, who worked on this stuff called craft tint, which is like a type of paper where you would brush this sort of fluid, this sort of activating fluid onto it, and you would ink it, and then you could brush this fluid on it. It would make this gray pattern sort of appear from within the page. It's also deadly toxic, by the way. You should, it's not good for you, that stuff. That kind of look with that sort of two color, like black plus another color behind, is something that I was very consciously kind of emulating guys like Roy Crane and Jack Tardy and stuff. This is an artist named Michael Golden, who I really like, and this is a book he did called The Nam for Marvel Comics, of all things. It was written by Doug Murray, who was a guy who actually served in Vietnam. So it's surprisingly, for a Marvel comic, it kind of degenerates later once these guys leave, and then like the Punisher shows up, and there's all this other kind of nonsense. But like the first 12 or so issues of it that are this writer, that's Doug Murray and Michael Golden, are I think some of the best like war comics that have ever been written, and they're not goofy. There's no superheroes in them. I mean, there's some funny stuff in it because people in bad situations often find respite in humor, so that's not that strange. It's also one of my favorite, just kind of an aside, it's also one of the first issues, one of my absolute favorite coloring jobs of any kind of mainstream comic. The first one is colored by Michael Golden himself. And I just love that. I'm a big fan of sort of non-literal color. And I love that this is colored in a way to evoke mood rather than to sort of connote an object, right? It bugs me when you see something that's been colored and like, well, here's an apple and it's red because apples are red. Like, I know that already. I know what color an apple is. You don't have to tell me that. Give me some narrative information. Set a tone. This, of course, on the very end are the classic EC war comics, Frontline Combat, and Two-Fisted Tales, from which my comic is drawing its title. And they're really they're very interesting and kind of subversive in some ways. They're actually really kind of anti-war comics. They take place, obviously, in combat and stuff, but they are very much sort of unexpectedly for comics ostensibly aimed at young readers in the in the 60s, the 50s and 60s. They're very sort of almost explicitly anti-war sometimes. And they had a huge bench of incredible artists, guys like Jack Davis and Russ Heath. Alex Toth did one story for them. But I always really liked this is Kurtzman himself who does this drawing. And I've liked Kurtzman's style the best of all of them. And he has these sort of crazy rubbery arm characters that I think later you see with people like Peter Bagg and Hate Comics, and really big, thick, black, brushy ink lines. And there's something about that style that I think really works somehow for depicting something that's kind of horrible, strangely. You wouldn't think that the sort of goofier style or sort of more abstracted style would work better for that, but to me it kind of seems to. Another one, and this is a real deep cut, but I actually found it, had to illicitly find a CBZ of this one. I don't think you can buy it anymore. But this is a Japanese manga that takes place in Vietnam, but all the characters are animals. And they're all sort of coded by nation. So I think the rabbits are British. I can't remember. The cats, I think, are the U.S. soldiers. It's called Apocalypse Meow. But really nice. It's a fun story. It's an interesting story, I love his depictions of vegetation and stuff like this. This isn't a whole story. This is a short story by Alex Toth called White Devil, Yellow Devil. Again, sort of strangely anti-war story. And I mean, man, just the way he draws vegetation and stuff is just pretty amazing. I think he's a great artist. He didn't do a ton of war stuff, so it's once that turns up, it's always take note. There's a beautiful page of his at the Billy, by the way, if anybody. Next time you're over there, it is a thing to behold. And then, of course, this is Bill Malden, who did Willie and Joe, a very famous comic that started kind of in World War II, and he was out on the front, kind of roaming around. He had a confrontation with General MacArthur, who was not a big fan of his drawing of his soldiers who, quote, looked like bums. But dudes were fighting in trenches and stuff, Anyway, I love the way he draws clothing and drapery. He was really a master of gesture. And obviously sort of like wry humor, fresh-spirited American troops, flushed with victory, are bringing in thousands of hungry, ragged, battle-weary prisoners. So of course, the gag here is that you can't really even tell which of them are the prisoners and which of them are, and nobody is fresh and spirited in this image. Oh, and incidentally, there is, I believe, still in Chicago an amazing exhibit of original Bill Malden pieces. There's got to be 200 of them at the show. If you can get up there to see it, it absolutely is amazing. So anyway, that's just kind of my sort of short rundown about things. Looks like we've got about 10 minutes before I have to clear. Does anybody have any questions? Sure.
I'm kind of curious, just because it seems like your approach kind of storytelling shifts from story to story, depending on what you're trying to tell. When you envision this in the front end, did you imagine it coming out the way that it did, either in length or in that kind of variety of like narrative choices?
Yeah. So this is a book that. Oh.
Did you imagine? Did you? Is that working?
No.
Okay. Did you imagine the variety of narrative choices at the front end of this project?
No, that was one of the things that I probably should have thought about in advance. Another thing I should have thought about in advance was like that, well, I'll get to that, but yeah, so this book has a number of short stories, and there's 12 or 15, I can't remember, all about different animals. And you know, one thing that you have to be cognizant of if you're dealing with nonfiction material is wanting to not be like a Wikipedia comic, you know. So I mean, there are a few places in here where I think it is pretty unashamedly kind of a Wikipedia comic, right? You know, where you draw a picture and then you have some words that say what the picture is. But you know, I didn't want to try to do a whole book like that because it would be really boring. So I had to figure out, there was some like how was I going to have a variety of different types of story in there? And so yeah, that's something that I kind of had to figure out. You know, and some of them were like I sort of had to set up sort of challenges for myself. So one was the wordless story. I was like, where I'm taking these page layouts from some other story. One story that involves dolphins, I kind of found out that there had been some environmentalist and animal rights groups had sued the U.S. Navy for their use of military dolphins. And so that one I sort of set up as a courtroom scene, right, during this lawsuit. So as the judge and the attorney are going back and forth, she's describing these various things that are going on with dolphins. So I set that one up kind of as a courtroom drama. And there are various other ones, like the one that with little circles in the center of it has sort of a gag where that I sort of made up. That's a Civil War story, and it's the first time that it may be the only time that a human, there was a prisoner exchange, and it was a Confederate soldier who was being swapped for a Union dog that had been captured. And so I set that up. I sort of made up the idea that like the human who was being swapped didn't realize until the very last minute that he was actually being swapped for a dog rather than a person. So he was sort of puffing up about how important he was that he was getting traded for some high caliber prisoner, and it turns out he's getting traded for a dog. So yeah, I mean, I had to kind of figure out ways not to use the same storytelling method over for each one of those stories. The other thing that I didn't really think very much about is that when you do a comic that's historical in nature, or really any comic, you start out and you design some characters and you gather a lot of visual reference and stuff like that. So like if this were, say for one of these stories that takes place in Vietnam during the Vietnam War era, you'd go out and you'd gather a bunch of pictures of, what American GIs look like, and you'd get Viet Cong uniforms and maybe get a few pictures of the various guns you need, and I would go out and get pictures of vegetation. You'd have to go like, how do you draw a rice paddy? That story has some modern architecture in it because it's sort of a flashback, flash forward thing. Like what does a modern Vietnamese town's school look like? And you would gather all that stuff up, and then if it were like a 200-page story, you'd just go ahead and draw the story, right? But if you've got 12 stories, and one's like during the Spanish Civil War, and one's during the Vietnam War, and one's during World War I, you do all that junk, and then you draw like 6 pages, and then you throw it all away. And then you go out and gather more of that stuff for each one of those stories, and it became a huge pain in the butt. And I didn't really think about it. I wound up being about 3 weeks late on this project, and I'm going to blame it all on that. Just the amount, I did not factor in that there would be all this, that stuff that you normally do once at the beginning of a project, I was doing 12 times. Any other questions? Sure.
Yeah, so what you mentioned talking about the backgrounds and sort of creating the environment for your characters to live in for each of those stories. You talked about doing the research for that. And you mentioned working from photographs. Did you ever work from the comics that you were inspired by and kind of grab their representations of those scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I think all cartoonists kind of emulate people they like. I mean, I think that like, oh, sorry.
Were you ever inspired directly by a cartoonist that you like in the background environment department?
Yes, yes. So like I think all cartoonists kind of grab stuff from people's different styles. You know, like there's a very, like you can always tell someone who grew up reading Calvin and Hobbes because they'll draw those white spruce trees or whatever they are that very distinctively, like there's a Calvin and Hobbes tree. Like, and you see people, you're like, you're a Calvin and Hobbes fan. But yeah, I mean, in fact, to the extent that I have a style, it's my style is like failing to copy people that I really like, and it comes out as something else, which I think is okay, the Rolling Stones kind of failed to copy like American blues music, and they came out with something else that people like, So in my work, like obviously, like I'm looking at Jack Tardy, looking at Roy Crane and stuff like this. In particular, in this book, I was looking at a lot of Hugo Pratt, who's a European cartoonist who did a series called Corto Maltese. And I saw an exhibit of his. I mean, I like his work in general, but I saw an exhibit of his in Lyon a few years ago, and it just blew my mind. In the sense that like all this stuff that you look at, like he's just beautiful vegetation and trees, and Corto Maltese is this guy who's this sort of swashbuckling, kind of like seafaring ladies' man who's always, in the tropics and stuff. So she's always drawing these like beautiful palm trees and thickets of vegetation and stuff. And you get this idea, you're like, wow, like every line must be so studied, and like how does he get everything to look so loose and energetic and beautiful? And then you look at the originals of these and you're like, well, he's doing that because he's on a deadline and he's going really fast, and a lot of this stuff is like, like felt tip pen, and like, it's like stuff's glued on there, and I was like, maybe I need to stop being so damn fussy with stuff like that. So like I don't think anyone reads my work that closely, but like if you were to compare, for example, the way I drew vegetation in earlier books to this book, I'm really doing a lot more loose, kind of scribbly sort of stuff. And in fact, this is kind of a funny example. I kind of came to that conclusion between, this is an image that was for the pitch for this book before I actually started drawing it. And I came to that conclusion sort of between pitching the book and actually working on it. And so this image in the book is actually a little bit different, or at least like the inking of it, because I actually stopped using this real sort of brushy, like this is all digital, but in real life I would be using like a number 3 round watercolor brush to get those, what they call feathering, which is when you take the end of a brush and you gradually increase the pressure on it and you bring them together like feathers on like a bird's wing. And I like a lot of people who kind of came of age of comics in the 90s, that was a real big thing that guys like Charles Burns and like Charles Burns and Dan Clowes and people like that would do, because they were in turn looking at a lot of like 50s and 60s stuff where that was a style. And so I kind of stopped doing that. I was like, I'm gonna get away with it. I'm gonna get away from that for this book. And so I started inking with basically like just a square brush, like a big block. And when I ink traditionally, I use a square blender instead of a watercolor brush, because I want that big blocky, like if you look at a Corto Maltese page and you look like, for example, like the folds and stuff in his jacket that he wears, they're just these big slashy square blocks. You see Toth does that a lot too. And so I kind of decided to dispense with this feathery stuff and to also dispense with a lot of these like real modulated lines like that. So it's funny you ask that, because if you look at this image in the book, it'll look a lot blockier, the inking and stuff. So I actually went through, and there's a story in the book that with this dog. This is a French messenger dog named Satan, and he winds up rescuing a French garrison. He has got carrier pigeons in those baskets, and they were able to release the carrier pigeon and give the location of this German battery that was attacking them to the allies who could then save the day. But I went through and re-inked this whole story, because this is the story. This story is what I used for my pitch, and it was all very brushy and very precise. Then when I got done with the book, I was like, well, this one looks, it's like that Sesame Street thing where like one of these things is not like the other. So I was like, well, this looks different than the rest of them. So I went through and inked this one again. I just started from scratch to make that match. So yes, I don't even know what that question was. Oh, it was about Hugo Pratt. Yeah, anyone else? Nobody? Okay, oh, all right.
Have any of your pets ever made cameos in your work?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think that they have. No, I did not put my pets in my work. I will say that weirdly, I do have a character that often appears in my books, and I completely forgot to put him in this one, and I realized it after it went to press. If you look in any of my books, and they've somehow managed to dredge up a really ancient book of mine that they're selling out there, that's so old I don't even have a copy of it anymore. It's that thing right there. Yeah, that thing. There's a newspaper boy, and it takes place in the 20s. There's a newspaper boy selling newspapers, and I've put that newspaper boy in every book. So that newspaper boy is also in that book Oyster War right there, in the beginning sequence, and the newspaper boy is also in my book I did about Amelia Earhart. And when this thing went off to press, and I was like, damn it, I forgot to put the newspaper boy in it. So no, so I have not had any animals. I've not put any of my real life animals in my work. I don't think.
Do we have time for one more?
Oh, absolutely.
So earlier you were talking about like wartime comics in general, and you were talking about how some of them were surprisingly anti-war. I'm curious about what your opinion is about how comics artists can indicate whether they're being critical of something or
I got you.
qualifying it, and how that might be similar or different to other mediums.
Okay.
In reference to anti-war comics, how can comic artists specifically indicate that they are for or against a topic that they are covering?
I mean, I think that not beating people over the head with it is the main thing, not like, the sort of like, you see, Timmy, so, this is why you should never play with fire. I think that kind of bonking people over the head with it is what you should avoid, and kind of I think that letting the narrative sort of speak for itself in a way. I think avoiding having anytime when a character is essentially being a mouthpiece for you is always kind of avoidable. It's like you don't want a big 200-page Ayn Rand speech all of a sudden coming out of somebody's mouth, And in the case of this book, I mean, I'm an animal person. I've been a vegetarian since I moved out of my mom's house. I'm very much an animal lover, and so I have very mixed feelings about animals being made to do things for people. I believe animals are sentient creatures mostly that can very obviously, if you have an animal, it's hard for me to imagine you saying, well, they don't have emotions. I mean, certainly is begging an emotion? I don't know. Is being hungry an emotion? Because my dog's in an emotional state all the time. But on the other hand, I didn't want to put a polemical thing out there that kind of, says we're awful for doing, it's a complex issue, and you can see the benefit of animals being used for this purpose in the sense that it saves, that there's this save of life that's going on. And it's also hard, I think it's sort of the old apocalypse now message. It's can you even talk about morality and rationality in something like war, which is just a complete absence of any kind of rationality, right? But in the case of this book, I mean, I didn't beat people over the head with it, but I feel like if you read this book with any kind of thought about, I wonder what the author thinks, you will probably find kind of a mix of admiration for what animals are capable of doing, and sadness that this is something that we do, and we often do without thinking about it, as if we're just justified, as if these creatures are our property, right, that we can throw under a tank and blow up, But I feel like it's a lot more effective. People don't like to be preach to, you know? So I think it's a lot more effective to have stories that have that kind of as an underpinning of the narrative. And maybe, you know, that will stick with you, you know, like, you know, later down the line, in a way like, I mean, it's kind of a cornball example, but I'm a big fan of the original Star Trek series from the 60s. And sometimes those are super ham-handed, you know, but like, there are some of those where like, it's this really cool science fiction story, and then like 2 weeks later, you're like, wait a minute, you know, like, that was about, you know, that was about something entirely different. You know, it didn't have to do with aliens. You know, like, oh wow, that's about the Vietnam War. You know, and I feel like if you can, you know, people love stories. I mean, narratives are what you respond to from when you're a little kid, right? So if you can wrap something in a narrative, that's the way I feel like you can get in somebody's brain with your point, all right? Because, you know, comics is a narrative art, and I think if you start sort of using the verbal component of comics to really be super polemical or rhetorical, that starts to bounce off, you know, and that if you just think about how your story is structured, right, like that's how you get through with those things. All right, I think we got somebody else in about 5 minutes, and I know they have to be out of here right at 5, so I guess I'm not going to, unless anybody's got any if anyone has any burning questions, you can ask me outside, because I will be signing books. So I have books for sale out there, and I have little book plates for anybody who wants them. So come see me, and thank you, everybody.